No one expected what was about to happen in that silent park. A boy in a wheelchair watched from a distance as a golden retriever dragged itself across the grass, ignoring everyone around it. Something was wrong with that dog. A leg was missing. But when their eyes met, the air changed. The dog stopped. The boy held his breath. And then, something impossible began to unfold before the emotional eyes of two people who watched everything in the background.
At the Esperanza Verde Animal Rescue Center, whispers circulated among the volunteers. A new rescue had arrived days before. Atlas, a golden retriever with golden fur but only 3 legs. Found abandoned on a rural road, with signs that he had been left there intentionally, the veterinarians confirmed. His hind leg had been amputated after an accident, but the emotional scar was even deeper. Atlas wasn't aggressive, he simply gave up. He would crawl into the darkest corners of the shelter, turning his face away whenever someone approached. Volunteers tried everything. Treats, toys, soft, melodious voices. Nothing worked. The dog carried something beyond physical pain. It was shame, as if he believed that not being perfect anymore meant he didn't deserve love. Sarah Mitchell, the shelter coordinator, watched Atlas with a heavy heart. She had seen hundreds of traumatized animals, but there was something different about that distant look. Atlas didn't just fear humans, he hid from himself, as if his own existence were a mistake that needed to be erased from everyone's sight.
Meanwhile, 15 kilometers away, Daniel was facing his own silent battle. At 14, he had been a promising swimmer, training at 5 in the morning, competitions on weekends, medals piling up on his bedroom wall. His coach said he had Olympic potential. Everything changed one summer afternoon. A careless dive into shallow water during a school camping trip. The impact against the submerged rocks. The terrifying silence when he tried to move his legs and nothing happened. 3 surgeries later, the diagnosis came like a death sentence. Permanent paraplegia. Daniel would never cry again. He simply shut himself off, transforming his anger into an insurmountable wall. His parents tried everything: occupational therapy, support groups, sessions with specialized psychologists. Daniel rejected each attempt with a cutting silence or monosyllabic answers. He locked himself in his room, avoided friends who still tried to visit him, and refused to touch the inflatable pool his father had set up in the backyard with naive hope. The wheelchair wasn't just an object. For Daniel, it was physical proof of everything he had lost and would never get back. It was Daniel's therapist, Dr. Helena Carvalho, who suggested the visit to the shelter, not as formal therapy, just as a different kind of outing. Daniel rolled his eyes when she mentioned it. "Dogs aren't going to fix my legs," he replied with sharp sarcasm, but his mother, Rebecca, had already scheduled it. It was a Saturday morning when she parked the adapted van in front of the Esperanza Verde Animal Rescue Center. Daniel reluctantly got out, the creaking of his wheelchair echoing in the empty parking lot. The sun filtered through the trees as Rebecca walked beside him, trying to hide her anxiety. The shelter was bustling. Dogs barked, volunteers scurried about, cats stretched in their enclosures, but Daniel showed no interest whatsoever. His gaze remained fixed on the ground, as if his mere presence there was a betrayal of his own principles. Sarah greeted them with a warm yet professional smile. She had been warned about Daniel's situation and knew that pressure would be counterproductive. "Feel free to explore," she said gently. "There's no obligation to interact with any of the animals. Just observe if you want to." Daniel nodded briefly, more out of automatic politeness than genuine interest, and began rolling his chair around the shelter's outdoor patio.
That's when Daniel saw him. In the farthest corner of the yard, separated from the other animals, was Atlas. The golden retriever remained motionless, lying in the shade of a tree, his head resting on his front paws. But what made Daniel stop completely was the sight of the missing leg. Atlas was incomplete, broken, just like him. Something inexplicable happened in that moment. Daniel hadn't planned it, hadn't thought about it. He simply began to move his chair toward Atlas. Rebecca noticed and instinctively took a step forward, but Sarah gently touched her arm, signaling for her to wait. The boy approached slowly, the sound of wheels on the dry grass breaking the tense silence. Atlas raised his head, his amber eyes meeting Daniel's for the first time. Nobody moved. Volunteers passing by stopped discreetly, holding their breath. Atlas, the dog who usually recoiled from any human approach, didn't run away. He simply watched Daniel with an intensity that seemed to transcend all barriers. And Daniel, for the first time in months, didn't look away. There was recognition there. Two broken beings facing each other, without judgment, without pity, only pure and silent understanding that transcended any words that could be spoken in that moment, so full of meaning.
Slowly, Atlas stood up. His movements were clumsy, his body compensating for the absence of his hind leg with a sideways sway that revealed his vulnerability. He took a hesitant step toward Daniel, then another. The volunteers exchanged incredulous glances. Sarah covered her mouth with her hand, hardly believing what she was witnessing. Atlas had never voluntarily approached anyone since his arrival. Daniel remained completely still, his heart racing in a way he hadn't felt in months. It wasn't fear, it was something different. Expectation, perhaps, or hope. That feeling he had buried so deeply he'd forgotten how to recognize it. Atlas stopped a few inches from the wheelchair, sniffing the air around the boy. His eyes never left Daniel's, as if silently seeking permission to take the next step. And then, it happened. Atlas moved closer and, with a surprisingly delicate movement for a dog of his size, rested his golden head in Daniel's lap. The weight was comforting, real. Daniel swallowed hard, his hands trembling as they hovered in the air, uncertain. For 2 long seconds, he just stood there, frozen between the impulse to touch and the fear of breaking that fragile moment that seemed suspended in time.
Finally, Daniel lowered his hand. His fingers touched Atlas's soft fur, and something inside him broke. It wasn't dramatic tears, just a silent tremor that ran through his entire body. "You're broken too," Daniel whispered, his voice cracked with restrained emotion. Atlas didn't move, only pressed his head more firmly against the boy, as if to say without words, "I know, I understand." Rebecca placed her hand on her chest, tears streaming freely down her face. It was the first time in months she had seen any kind of genuine emotion in her son. Sarah approached cautiously, not wanting to interrupt the moment, but needing to understand what she had just witnessed. "He's never done this before," she murmured, more to herself than to anyone else. "Atlas rejected all the volunteers, all the interested families. But with you." Daniel stroked Atlas's head repeatedly, his movements gaining confidence with each passing second. The dog closed his eyes, a deep sigh escaping his chest, as if an immense weight had finally been lifted. There, in that silent courtyard, 2 beings who had given up trusting the world found in each other something that no one else could offer: understanding without judgment, acceptance without conditions, connection without demands for perfection or completeness.
Daniel began visiting the shelter every day, not out of therapeutic obligation, but by his own choice. For the first time since the accident, he had a reason to get out of bed beyond the mechanical routine imposed by his parents. Atlas waited for him in the same corner of the yard, and as soon as he heard the characteristic sound of the wheelchair, his tail would begin to wag gently, a hesitant movement that grew in intensity as Daniel approached. The following weeks brought subtle but profound transformations.
Daniel began talking to Atlas about things he had never shared with anyone: his fears, his anger, the feeling of having been robbed of a future that seemed guaranteed. Atlas listened to everything in silence, his constant presence serving as an emotional anchor. The dog offered no solutions or empty advice. He simply existed beside Daniel, and that was exactly what the boy needed in that moment of silent reconstruction. Sarah watched the pair with growing admiration. Atlas not only tolerated Daniel, he responded to the boy in ways that surprised even the shelter's most experienced veterinarians. He learned to walk alongside the wheelchair, adjusting his uneven gait to Daniel's rhythm. He learned to lie down patiently during long conversations. And most importantly, Atlas resumed eating regularly, regaining the lost sparkle in his amber eyes. News of the connection between Daniel and Atlas spread through the shelter and soon reached the local community. A journalist from a small regional news outlet visited the Green Hope Center and captured a simple video. Daniel sitting in his chair with Atlas lying beside him, both silently watching the sunset. The video went viral overnight, accumulating millions of views. The comments flooded the post. People from all over the country shared their own stories of overcoming adversity, loss, and new beginnings. But not everyone believed it. "It's just a coincidence," someone wrote. "The dog probably does this to anyone who offers it attention." Another commented, "They're using the boy's disability to get likes." The cutting words reached Daniel through schoolmates who still followed him on social media. For 3 days, Daniel didn't return to the shelter. The doubt planted by the malicious comments grew in his mind like a weed. What if it all really meant nothing? What if he had created a fantasy to fill the void? But Atlas didn't forget. He refused food. He refused walks with volunteers. He just stood at the entrance gate, waiting, his eyes fixed on the path Daniel always took, proving that some bonds transcend doubts and the skepticism of others. When Daniel finally returned, it was Rebecca who told him about Atlas, how the dog had stopped eating, how he waited at the gate every day, how no volunteer could comfort him. Daniel felt a pang in his chest. It wasn't guilt, it was responsibility. Someone needed him. Someone had chosen to trust him even when he didn't trust himself. He asked his mother to take him to the shelter immediately. Atlas was in the same spot, lying near the gate, his head resting on his paws. But when he heard the familiar sound of the wheelchair, he sprang to his feet and ran, his gallop clumsy yet perfect. Daniel opened his arms, and Atlas practically threw himself against him, licking his face, his tail wagging with a joy that made his whole body tremble. "I'm sorry," Daniel whispered, hugging the dog. "I shouldn't have doubted us." Sarah approached with a proposal that would change everything. The Vita Nova Children's Hospital had contacted the shelter, asking Daniel and Atlas to visit children with physical disabilities. On the day of the first visit, Daniel was nervous, but Atlas walked confidently beside him. When they entered the pediatric ward, something magical happened. Children who hadn't spoken in weeks reached out to touch Atlas. A 7-year-old girl with prosthetics on both legs laughed for the first time since her surgery. Atlas responded to each child with the same gentle patience he had offered Daniel, as if he knew exactly what each one needed to hear without words. Months later, Daniel stood at the edge of an adapted Olympic swimming pool, his first Paralympic swimming training session. He looked at the stands, and there was Atlas, sitting next to Rebecca, his head held high with pride. Daniel dove in, and for the first time since the accident, he didn't feel the weight of loss. He felt possibility. Because Atlas taught him that strength doesn't come from being whole, but from accepting who you've become and transforming your scars into bridges that connect you to others who need to know they're not alone. Starting over doesn't erase the past. It only gives it new meaning with shared courage and renewed purpose.